most dangerous assumptions are the ones we inherit without question. I have spent my career working with atoms in ways most people never will. I have organized their division, calculated their yields, witnessed their transformation from abstract symbols on a chalkboard into forces that reshape cities. And in all that work, one truth became unavoidable. Everything you think you know about what matter is, everything you were taught about the solid permanence of physical things, is wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. Atoms are not tiny marbles. They're not miniature solar systems. They are not even reliably there when you're not looking. What they actually are is so strange, so contrary to everyday experience, that even those of us who work with them daily must continuously resist the urge to picture them incorrectly. Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from. And if this story stays with you, you're welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next. I am holding a piece of uranium in my office at Los Alamos. It is 1943, late autumn, and the weight of this metal in my hand feels exactly as you would expect metal to feel. Dense, cool, solid. The surface has that characteristic gray-black sheen. If I were to drop it, it would fall according to laws Newton understood perfectly well 2.5 centuries ago. Everything my senses tell me suggests this object is, in the most fundamental sense, a thing, a solid thing, permanent, knowable, but I know better. This is not arrogance. It is the result of years spent learning to see past what evolution designed my eyes and hands to perceive. Human beings evolved to navigate a world of medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds. We developed intuitions about rocks and trees and animals. We never developed intuitions about things 100 million times smaller than anything we can see. Why would we? For all of human history, until very recently, the atomic realm was completely inaccessible to us. Our ancestors who survived were the ones who could judge whether a branch would hold their weight, not the ones who pondered the nature of matter itself. So when I tell you that atoms are not what you think they are, I am not speaking theoretically. I am speaking from the accumulated weight of evidence that has forced me, step by step, to abandon every comfortable assumption I once held. On the shelf beside my desk sits a Geiger counter. It is a simple device, really. A tube filled with gas, a wire running through its center, a small speaker. When radiation passes through the tube, it ionizes the gas, creating a tiny electrical pulse. The speaker clicks, that is all. But this modest instrument changed everything for me because it made the invisible audible. Before devices like this existed, radioactivity was merely a hypothesis, an explanation for certain photographic plates that darkened in drawers where no light could reach them. The Geiger counter transformed abstraction into sound. Click, 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 each click representing an atom transforming, releasing energy, becoming something else. I first encountered one at Cambridge in 1926, working in the Cavendish laboratory under Rutherford. I was 22 years old and convinced I understood physics. I had studied mathematics, could solve differential equations in my head, had read Maxwell and Boltzmann and Einstein. I thought understanding meant being able to calculate. I was wrong. Understanding means being able to accept reality even when it violates everything your common sense insists must be true. Rutherford had already demonstrated, years before I arrived, that atoms were mostly empty space. His experiment was elegantly simple. He fired alpha particles at a thin sheet of gold foil. Alpha particles are helium nuclei, positively charged, moving very fast. According to the prevailing model of the time, the atom was thought to be like plum pudding, a diffuse positive charge with electrons embedded in it, distributed evenly throughout. If that model were correct, the alpha particles should have passed straight through the gold foil with perhaps some minor deflection, like bullets through fog. Most of them did pass straight through, but some bounced back, not just deflected, bounced back, as if they had struck something solid and immensely dense. Rutherford himself said it was as if you had fired a 15-inch artillery shell at tissue paper and it had rebounded and hit you. The only explanation was that the atom's mass was concentrated in an incredibly tiny, incredibly dense nucleus with the electrons orbiting far outside. The atom was not pudding. It was almost entirely empty space, with a minute kernel of concentrated matter at its center. When I first learned this, I tried to visualize it. If you could expand an atom to the size of a football stadium, the nucleus would be smaller than a marble at the center of the field. Everything else, all that vast emptiness, would be occupied by electrons, except electrons do not orbit like planets. That is where the stadium analogy breaks down, and where my intuitions began their real collapse. I remember the day I first truly grasped the implications of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It was not in a lecture hall. It was late at night in my rooms at Cambridge, reading Heisenberg's paper from 1927. The mathematics was clear enough. The principle states that you cannot simultaneously know both the position and momentum of a particle with arbitrary precision. The more accurately you measure one, the less accurately you can know the other. This is not a limitation of measurement technology. It is not because our instruments are crude. It is a fundamental property of reality itself. But the mathematics alone did not convey the full strangeness. It was only when I sat there, trying to picture an electron, trying to imagine where it was and how fast it was moving, that I felt the vertigo. There is no where. There is no trajectory. The electron does not have a position in the way a baseball has a position. Until you measure it, the electron exists as a probability distribution, a cloud of possible locations. It is not hiding somewhere in that cloud, waiting to be found. It genuinely does not have a definite position until the moment of measurement collapses the probability wave into a single outcome. This is not philosophy. This is observed, measured, verified reality. We have tested these principles thousands of times in thousands of ways. They are not interpretations. They are descriptions of behavior that atoms demonstrably exhibit. I began to understand that the solid world around me, the desk beneath my hands, the floor beneath my feet, was nothing like what it appeared to be. The solidity I felt was not atoms touching atoms in the way billiard balls touch. Atoms never actually touch. What I perceived as solidity was electromagnetic repulsion. The electrons in the atoms of my hand repel the electrons in the atoms of the desk. The repulsion feels like contact, like resistance, like solidity, but it is force, not substance. And then there was the matter of what atoms are made of. When I was young, I learned that atoms were the fundamental, indivisible units of matter. The word itself means uncuttable in Greek. But by the time I reached Cambridge, we knew atoms were divisible. Electrons had been discovered by Thomson in 1897. The nucleus had been revealed by Rutherford, and the nucleus itself was composite, protons and neutrons, discovered by Chadwick in 1932. But even that was not the end. We now know that protons and neutrons are themselves made of quarks, held together by forces we are only beginning to understand. The deeper we look, the less we find anything we can honestly call a thing. We find patterns of energy, fields of probability, interactions governed by principles that have no analog in everyday experience. I learned these truths gradually, reluctantly. Each step required abandoning some cherished intuition. But the evidence was overwhelming. The experiments were reproducible. The mathematics worked. And slowly, I built a new intuition, one based not on what medium-sized objects do, but on what atoms actually do. By the time I came to Los Alamos, this understanding was no longer academic. We were building a device that would exploit the structure of the atom in the most dramatic way possible. We would split uranium nuclei, releasing the binding energy that held them together. The amount of energy was staggering, predicted by Einstein's equation. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. A small amount of mass, when converted to energy, yields an enormous release. This was not speculation. We had measured it, we had calculated it, and now we were engineering it. The uranium in my hand contains roughly 10 to the 23rd atoms. That is a 1 followed by 23 zeros, an incomprehensible number. Each of those atoms is mostly empty space. Each contains a nucleus held together by forces that barely exist in the human scale world. And if we can induce just a small fraction of those nuclei to split, the energy released will be equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosive. This is what understanding atoms makes possible. Not comfort, not confirmation of our intuitions, but power. Terrible, awesome power derived from seeing the world as it actually is, not as it appears to be. I set the uranium back on my desk. The Geiger counter on the shelf continues its quiet clicking. Each click is an atom decaying, transforming, releasing energy. Each click is a reminder that the solid, permanent world we think we inhabit is, at its foundation, something far stranger and more fluid than we can easily accept. What I'm about to explain is not easy. It will require you to abandon assumptions so deep you may not even realize you hold them. But if you can manage that, if you can set aside what your senses insist must be true, and instead follow the evidence where it leads, you will see the world transformed. Not into something mystical or incomprehensible, but into something more beautiful and more terrifying than you imagined possible. The atom is not a thing. It is a process, a pattern, a probability. And once you understand that, nothing looks quite the same again. The letter arrived in the summer of 1939. I was at Berkeley, teaching, when Alexander Sachs brought Einstein's warning to Roosevelt. I did not see the letter myself initially, but its contents reached me through channels that mattered. Einstein, along with Szilard, was warning the president that Germany might be developing an atomic bomb. The theatics was clear enough. The possibility was real. And if the Nazis achieved it first, the consequences would be unthinkable. I had known this was theoretically possible since 1938, when Hahn and Strassmann published their findings on uranium fission. Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch had provided the theoretical explanation shortly after. When a uranium nucleus absorbs a neutron, it can split into two lighter nuclei, releasing enormous energy and additional neutrons. Those neutrons can then split other uranium nuclei. Chain reaction. The mathematics was straightforward. The implications were not. What changed for me was not the science. I had understood the science. What changed was the realization that this knowledge would now be applied, whether I participated or not. The question was not whether an atomic weapon would be built. The question was who would build it first. I remember walking across the Berkeley campus in September of that year, just after Germany invaded Poland. The students moved between buildings, carrying books, discussing assignments, completely unaware that the fundamental nature of warfare was about to transform. I envied them briefly. Then I went back to my office and began calculating cross-sections for uranium-235. The physics required to build an atomic bomb was complex but not mysterious. You needed a critical mass of fissile material. You needed to bring that material together quickly enough that it would not pre-detonate. You needed to understand neutron multiplication, reflection, moderation. None of this was secret knowledge in the academic sense. The journals had published the relevant papers. Any competent physicist could follow the reasoning. But moving from theory to engineering was a different matter entirely. It required industrial capacity, precision manufacturing, enormous resources. It required solving hundreds of practical problems that textbooks never mentioned. And it required a shift in thinking that I found profoundly disturbing. In physics, we seek to understand nature. We ask questions about how things work. We derive principles, test them, refine them. The work is intellectual, abstract, beautiful in its way. But weaponeering is different. You are not asking how nature works. You are asking how to make nature kill as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible. The mathematics is the same. The differential equations do not care about your intention, but the purpose inverts everything. I struggled with this in ways I did not fully articulate at the time. I told myself that the Nazis were the real threat, that stopping them justified any means. I told myself that if I did not do this work, someone less capable might fail, and then we would lose the war and lose civilization itself. These justifications were not entirely wrong, but they were not entirely honest either. What actually compelled me was something more primal. and less noble. I wanted to see if it could be done. I wanted to know if the theory would work in practice. I wanted to solve the problem because it was the hardest problem anyone had ever attempted. This is not an admirable motivation, but it is a true one. The rest, the politics, the moral necessity, the urgency of war, these were real factors. But beneath them was simple curiosity, the same drive that had led me into physics in the first place. By 1942, I was asked to direct the weapons laboratory. They chose Los Alamos, a remote mesa in New Mexico. I accepted. I recruited the best physicists I could find. Fermi, Beeth, Teller, Feynman, dozens of others. We were building something that had never existed. We were turning probability clouds and quantum mechanics into a deliverable weapon. The work consumed everything. We lived on that mesa, isolated from the ordinary world, focused entirely on a single question. How do you release the binding energy of atomic nuclei in a controlled, devastating burst? We tested materials. We calculated yields. We designed initiators, reflectors, casings. We argued about implosion versus gun-type assembly. Every day brought new problems, and every problem required understanding atoms at a level of practical detail that no one had ever needed before. I began to see atoms differently during this period, not as abstract objects of study, but as tools, as resources, as the fundamental machinery that could be manipulated to produce specific effects. A uranium atom is not just mostly empty space with a dense nucleus. It is also a container of binding energy, a trigger for chain reactions, a component in a larger mechanism. The more I understood atoms in this practical sense, the more I recognized how distant they were from anything human intuition could grasp. One afternoon in early 1943, I watched a demonstration of neutron behavior in a subcritical assembly. We had a sphere of uranium surrounded by detectors. We introduced a neutron source. The detectors registered neutrons bouncing through the material, being absorbed, causing fissions, releasing more neutrons. The pattern was complex but predictable. You could see the multiplication factor changing as we adjusted the geometry. You could see in the data the edge of criticality approaching. What struck me was how ordinary it all appeared. Machines humming, technicians recording numbers, engineers adjusting configurations. But what we were observing was matter transforming itself according to quantum principles that defied visualization. Each uranium nucleus that split did not split because it decided to. It split because its quantum state, when perturbed by a neutron, evolved according to probability. Some nuclei absorbed neutrons and became unstable. Others did not. There was no way to predict which individual nucleus would split. You could only calculate probabilities for populations of nuclei. This is the heart of quantum mechanics, and it remains deeply strange no matter how familiar you become with the mathematics. Events at the atomic level are fundamentally probabilistic, not because we lack information, not because our measurements are imperfect, but because reality itself does not determine outcomes until they occur. The uranium nucleus exists in a superposition of states until the moment of interaction, and only then does one particular outcome manifest. I found myself thinking about this constantly. If the foundation of matter is probabilistic, what does that mean for the world we perceive as solid and deterministic? The answer is statistical averaging. When you have 10 to the 23rd atoms, the law of large numbers takes over. Individual quantum uncertainties average out. The collective behavior becomes predictable. A kilogram of uranium will release a specific amount of energy when its nuclei fission, not because each nucleus behaves identically, but because the aggregate behavior follows statistical laws with extraordinary precision. This is why the bomb would work. Not because we could control individual atoms, but because we could control populations of atoms. We could create conditions where the probability of fission cascaded into certainty of explosion. We could engineer geometry and materials so that neutron multiplication exceeded 1, and once that threshold was crossed, the chain reaction would proceed on its own, faster than any human reaction time, releasing energy that had been locked in atomic nuclei since those atoms formed in the furnaces of dying stars billions of years ago. The weight of this knowledge became heavier as the work progressed. We were not just building a weapon. We were proving that the strange, counterintuitive principles of quantum mechanics were not merely theoretical curiosities. They were the actual rules governing matter, and those rules could be exploited. The atom was not what anyone thought it was. It was not solid, not predictable in the classical sense, not even properly localized in space, but it was real, and it was powerful, and we were learning to harness that power. In June 1943, I stood on the mesa at sunset, looking out over the desert. The sky was that particular shade of orange you only see in the high desert, the air thin and clear. Somewhere below, the ordinary world continued. People went to work, raised children, worried about ration cards and letters from the front. They lived in a world where objects were solid, where cause and effect followed comprehensible patterns, where matter was matter and energy was energy. But I knew better. I knew that the ground beneath my feet was mostly empty space. I knew that the atoms in my body were constantly vibrating, their electrons existing as probability clouds, their nuclei held together by forces that had no classical analog. I knew that matter and energy were interchangeable, and I knew how to prove it in the most definitive way possible. This knowledge did not feel like enlightenment. It felt like burden. Once you see past the illusion of solidity, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand that atoms are not things, but processes, patterns of probability and force, the comfortable certainty of the material world dissolves. What remains is more accurate, more powerful, and infinitely more unsettling. The disruption was not external. It was internal. It was the permanent alteration of how I understood reality itself. The test was scheduled for the 16th of July, 1945. We called it Trinity. The name came to me from a John Donne poem, though I have never been entirely certain why that particular reference emerged. Perhaps because the work felt sacred in some terrible way. Perhaps because I sensed we were about to witness something that would divide history into before and after. The device sat on a tower in the New Mexico desert, 100 feet above the sand. We had designed it as an implosion weapon, a sphere of plutonium surrounded by conventional explosives, carefully shaped to compress the core uniformly when detonated. The physics was elegant. The engineering was brutally difficult. We had spent months perfecting the explosive lenses, the initiator, the tamper. Everything had to work with microsecond precision, or the device would fizzle, scattering radioactive material, but failing to achieve the chain reaction we needed. I understood the mechanism completely. When the explosives fired, they would compress the plutonium core to twice its normal density. At that density, the material would go supercritical. Neutrons from the initiator would begin splitting nuclei. Each fission would release more neutrons. The multiplication factor would exceed 1. The population of free neutrons would double, then double again, then again, roughly 80 times in a microsecond. The energy released would vaporize the device, the tower, and everything nearby. The temperature at the center would briefly exceed that of the sun's core. All of this I knew. I had calculated it. I had checked others' calculations. I had supervised the construction of every component. And yet, standing in the bunker at 5:29 inches the morning, watching the countdown, I felt something that numbers could not capture. Fear, certainly. Excitement, but also a strange sense of unreality, as if I were observing myself from outside, wondering what kind of man brings this particular knowledge into the world. The flash came first, light brighter than 1,000 suns, turning night into day across the entire desert. Then, seconds later, the sound, a crack like the earth splitting, followed by a long, rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the fireball, rising, expanding, forming the characteristic mushroom shape we had predicted but never seen. I watched this and thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The words came unbidden. They were melodramatic, perhaps, but they felt true. We had crossed a threshold. We had proven that the quantum mechanical principles governing atomic nuclei were not merely theoretical. They were exploitable. And in exploiting them, we had created something that made all previous weapons obsolete. The yield was approximately 20 kilotons, equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. We had destroyed the tower completely. The sand beneath the detonation point had been fused into a glassy substance we later called trinitite. Radiation detectors registered levels far beyond anything natural. We had, quite literally, brought a piece of stellar nucleosynthesis to Earth. The energy that had been binding those plutonium nuclei together had been locked in place since those atoms formed in some supernova billions of years ago. We had released it in a microsecond. But the technical success raised questions I had been avoiding. The Nazis had already surrendered. Germany was defeated. The original justification for the weapon no longer existed. Yet, we had continued. Why? Partly inertia. Partly because the project had its own momentum. Partly because I wanted to see if it would work. And partly because the alternative, stopping, meant confronting what we had built without the excuse of necessity. 3 weeks later, we used the weapon on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. I was not on the planes. I did not see the destruction firsthand, but I saw the photographs. I read the reports. 70,000 dead in Hiroshima, instantly or within hours. The buildings vaporized, the people burned or crushed or poisoned by radiation. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that every one of those deaths had occurred because I understood atoms better than most people. This is not false modesty. The bomb would likely have been built without me, but perhaps not as quickly, not as efficiently. I had organized the effort. I had solved critical problems. I had recruited the right people and directed their work. Blood was not solely on my hands, but it was on my hands nonetheless. What troubled me most was not guilt. Exactly. Though guilt was present. What troubled me was the recognition that my understanding of atoms, which had seemed so pure, so beautiful, so fundamentally about truth, had led directly to mass death. The quantum mechanics that revealed the probabilistic nature of reality, the equations that describe nuclear forces, the mathematics of neutron multiplication, none of this was evil in itself. It was just description. Nature behaves this way, whether we like it or not. But description enabled application, and application in this case meant annihilation. I began to see the atom differently after Hiroshima. Before, it had been an object of study, a puzzle to solve, a window into the fundamental structure of reality. After, it was also a weapon. And once you see something as a weapon, you cannot unsee it. The uranium nucleus does not care whether its fission releases energy for a power plant or a bomb. The physics is identical. The difference is human intention, and human intention is far more unstable than any atomic nucleus. In the months that followed, I testified before committees, advised the government, argued for international control of atomic energy. I believed, perhaps naively, that if we could explain to policymakers how these weapons worked, how devastating they were, how impossible it would be to defend against them, then perhaps rational minds would conclude that their use must be prevented. But what I discovered was that understanding atoms did not grant wisdom about human nature. Politicians and generals grasped the weapon's power easily enough. What they did not grasp, or did not care about, was the existential danger of a world where multiple nations possessed such weapons. Teller wanted to build a hydrogen bomb, a weapon that would use atomic fission to trigger nuclear fusion, releasing energy thousands of times greater than the bombs we had already built. The physics was clear. Fusion of light nuclei releases even more energy per unit mass than fission of heavy nuclei. The sun runs on fusion. We could replicate that process on Earth. The question was not whether it could be done, but whether it should be done. I opposed it, not because I suddenly became a pacifist. I understood military necessity, but I also understood that there was no military target that required weapons of that magnitude. Cities could be destroyed with fission bombs. Hydrogen bombs were not weapons in any tactical sense. They were instruments of annihilation, designed to kill millions rather than thousands. Building them would ensure that other nations built them, and once multiple nations possessed them, their use became not unlikely but virtually certain over a long enough timeline. My opposition did not matter. The hydrogen bomb was built. The Soviet Union built their own. The arms race I had feared became reality, and through all of this, I kept thinking about atoms, about how strange it was that objects so small, so removed from human experience, could determine the fate of civilizations. Most people still thought of atoms as tiny solid balls. They imagined electrons orbiting like planets around a sun. They pictured something comprehensible, something that fit their intuitions. But I knew the truth. I knew that atoms were mostly empty space. I knew that their electrons did not orbit but existed as probability clouds. I knew that you could not simultaneously know an electron's position and momentum. I knew that quantum mechanics was not just a mathematical formalism, but an accurate description of how matter actually behaves. And this knowledge had led to weapons that could end human civilization. Not because the knowledge was evil, not because quantum mechanics was somehow morally wrong, but because understanding how nature works inevitably leads to the ability to manipulate nature, and humans are very good at finding destructive uses for any capability they acquire. I thought often about the Geiger counter in my office, the one that had first made atomic decay audible to me. Each click represented a nucleus transforming, releasing energy, becoming something else. The process was random at the level of individual atoms, but statistically predictable for large populations. This same principle governed the chain reaction in a bomb. You could not predict which specific nucleus would fission when, but you could predict with extraordinary precision how many would fission per microsecond once criticality was exceeded. The atom revealed itself to be not a thing but a process, not solid but probabilistic, not permanent but constantly transforming. And in understanding this, we had gained power beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. We had also created a problem that we might not be capable of solving, because the human mind evolved to handle spears and arrows, not weapons that could vaporize cities. We were clever enough to split the atom, but perhaps not wise enough to refrain from using that knowledge to destroy ourselves. This was the consequence of understanding. This was the burden of seeing atoms as they actually are, rather than as we wish them to be. Knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge is power. And power in human hands has always been dangerous. The only difference now was scale. We had moved from the ability to kill individuals to the ability to kill species. And we had done it by understanding the most fundamental constituents of matter. I carried this knowledge like a weight, not just the technical knowledge of how atoms work, but the experiential knowledge of what happens when that understanding is applied without wisdom. The atoms in my body, the atoms in the desert sand, the atoms in the ruins of Hiroshima, they all followed the same laws. They did not care about morality or consequence. They simply were what they were, behaving according to principles that had been discovered, refined, and weaponized. The internal conflict was this. I had sought truth, and truth had led to horror. Not because truth itself was horrible, but because truth was powerful, and power was dangerous. And now I could not unknow what I knew. I could not undo what I had helped create. I could only live with it, and try to prevent its worst uses, and wonder whether understanding atoms had been worth the cost.